Brilliant. Well, last spring, hopefully this will work. I'll get close to the back. It's not going to show me. Anyway, last spring, I was sat in a foyer of a hotel in Leeds. It was going to be a picture of the hotel in Leeds. I'm sure it'll appear in a minute. At the Anglican Mission in England conference. And it was late in the evening, and I got chatting to a couple of Muslim men in their 20s who'd just been to the gym. And they were sat around waiting for a taxi to take them home. They came over and sat with us, and we had all the usual chit-chat, who they were, who we were. They were barbers from Bradford, if you're wondering. I never worked out why they were coming to a gym in Leeds if they were from Bradford, but anyway. But I think as soon as they realised they were sat with me and a couple of other church ministers, they saw it as an opportunity to try and convert us to Islam. And so we had a great conversation for about 10 or 15 minutes. We got talking about what we believe, what's similar, what's different about the Quran and the Bible and where they come from. But as their taxi pulled up and they kind of left us, here you are, look, we were sat just in that nice little corner over at the top. As the taxi pulled up, there was a question left hanging. And it was this: how can we really know God? How can we really know God? Not just some things about God, not just some stuff about him, but how can we really know him? And what was interesting is these two lads conceded, as far as they were aware, you couldn't. You couldn't really know God. The Quran, it told them things about God. They had a list of things they believed were true about the God they believed in. But they could never really, truly know him personally. He was, if you like, too distant, too other. There was a chasm, if you like, that could never be crossed. For them, God stood on one side and just sent messages across it. Instructions, guidance, ways to live, what to believe. But the chasm was there. But what if? What if that chasm between the God who created everything, the one who ruled the world, who brought it into existence, who is so different and so other from us, those who created, who live here on earth, what if actually that chasm can be crossed? What if we can really know God? What if he doesn't have to be just a distant figure, sending messages across the gap? But what if actually God came close? He drew near. He let us know him. What he's really like at a relational level. If you like, that kind of thing. It is the difference between reading a Wikipedia article about somebody so that you know them and actually being in and involved in their life. We want to know God truly, don't we? Not just stuff about him, but really know him. Well, these few verses in John 1 are all about how people can actually come to know God. Know him as a person up close, not just as an entry in an encyclopedia, not just as someone far and distant. Because Jesus has come to make God the Father known to us. That's where John finishes this little section, if you like, in verse 18, doesn't he? He says, no one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. It's a little bit of an odd verse to work out what it's saying. And there's probably a better analogy than this, but this will do. And I just need a little bit of help here. Does someone want to tell me, if you could meet anyone living at the moment, who would it be? If you could meet anyone living, who would you choose to meet? Go on, someone give me a name. Someone give me a person. Oh, go on, Nathan. Jesus, very good. Let's pick someone else, because otherwise you just ruin my analogy, but it's perfect. Steven Spielberg, very good. And I know who that is, so that helps. Right, now imagine Gareth here. Gareth enters a competition. And for probably the only time in his life, he actually wins something. And he wins something good, not just a packet of crisps. And he wins this competition. In the post next week, when the strikes are finished, turns up a signed letter, a photograph, a nice personalised note, and a whole box of other goodies from Steven Spielberg. Wouldn't that be wonderful? It's amazing, isn't it? What Gareth does, he opens it all up, he puts the picture on the wall in a beautiful frame that he's bought, pride of place. Every time you go round for the next 6 months, he gets the letter out and he shows you it and he tells you about all the things that he got. It's great. They become his prized possessions. He puts them in a little box and keeps them safe forever. And suddenly Gareth now feels he has a little bit of a connection there. A little bit like he knows him a little bit more. Now, imagine the story goes a little bit differently. This time, instead of winning the second prize, Gareth actually wins the top prize. And as well as the photograph and the letter, Steven Spielberg is actually going to come to Sheffield to visit Gareth, to come to his house and have dinner with him. He's going to talk with him and actually be there. How much better is that? I mean, both the prizes are amazing, but one is a definite step up, isn't it? Well, that's what verses 16 and 17 are trying to get at. God hasn't and he doesn't change, but we have received grace upon grace. The idea is when Jesus comes, we receive a new kind of grace, a better grace, a kind of grace that goes beyond the grace we had already received and that God had already shown. Verses 16 and 17. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Grace upon grace. Think of a grace that builds upon one that's come before. It's the same idea as what we had before, but it's taken to a whole new level. At first, God's people just got a glimpse of it. But now we see it in its totality. They were both wonderful signs of God's grace. When God gave the law to Israel, it was a sign of his grace and his goodness. But the second grace we receive was just materially so much better, because Jesus crossed the chasm from one side between God and the created world, and he entered our world. Sometimes in that verse 17, we're tempted to put a little but where the semicolon is. I don't know if you look down and see that. Sometimes we tend to put a but there. You know, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. I don't think that's what John is saying. Yes, there is something fundamentally different between the law spoken to Moses and Jesus coming, but it's more an extension of what has come before rather than something completely new. It's different, but it's not opposite. God has always been gracious to his people. Let me skip on a couple of slides. Missed that one. God has always been gracious to his people. He was always given to them undeservedly. He's always revealed something true of himself to them. God doesn't change. But before we had only the written word. Now we have the one and only Son. God didn't just want to tell us things about himself. He didn't just want to speak to us and tell us how to live in this world. But he sent his Son in the flesh to live amongst us so we could really, truly know him. It's the most remarkable thing, isn't it, those words in verse 14, which we dwelt on if you were here on Friday night. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word, the one through whom the whole world was created, who sat at the right hand of God the Father, the Son of the Father, he came to us. He became like us. He made his home here so we could know him. That word dwelt, he dwelt among us, has so many overtones with the Old Testament. God has dwelt with his people before, but not like this since the very first days of Eden. God did dwell with his people in some sense, didn't he, in the tabernacle and in the temple, but it wasn't like this. Then the people were separated from God. There were curtains and walls between them. Hardly anyone could actually come into God's presence. You didn't get shepherds coming in from the field at night into the very presence of God. What they had were mostly his words to them on tablets of stone that Moses brought down the mountain. But even Moses, I don't know if you heard it in our reading in Exodus 33, which Mike read, who asked to see God's glory, even he could not see his face. This is what Exodus 33 said. But God said, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." And the Lord said, "Behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on a rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by." That was then. But now the very Son of God has come to dwell amongst us. And why? To show us God's glory. To show us God's glory. The glory that Moses couldn't see. The glory that he had to be shielded from. Now that glory has been revealed to us most fully in Jesus coming to us. But as you stop and think about it, something seems a little bit off, doesn't it? Let me picture for you two scenes, and you'll see what seems off. Picture Moses, first of all, the leader of God's people. He goes to speak with God, and a cloud descends. There is thunder, there is lightning. And he asks, "Can I see your glory?" So on a mountainside, Moses goes, and he's in the cleft of the rock. And God's glory passes him by. And as he looks out at the end, he can just see God's back disappearing into the distance. And Moses bows down and he worships. Scene 1. Scene 2. A dark night. A young woman is giving birth in an out-of-the-way place. A baby is born in a manger in the middle of nowhere because there was no room in an inn. Then, gathered round that baby are not the leaders of the world and the influential. It's not the Moseses of the world, but some shepherds straight off the hillside, the common people, the poor people. Which one of those pictures conveys God revealing his glory most to you? Which of those is a picture of what we sometimes have in our minds when we think of what it is to see God's glory? Often we think glory is, don't we, it's about power. It's about a kind of wow moment. It's the epitome of glory when somebody is lifted up in a power and authority, like a celebrity or a leader, and they're worshipped by those around. Magnificence, beauty, renown. They're what glory is about. But the clearest, the most complete display of God's glory is seen in his grace and his mercy as he sends his Son to us. It's seen of that baby in a manger. It's seen in drawing near to people like us. It's seen in drawing near to people who rejected him. This is the picture behind me of the sculpture. I don't know if you saw it. It was on the screen as we came in that Jason chose for this week. It's in Yorkshire. It's not far from here, actually. And it's Mary standing in the form and the shape of a cross, holding out the baby Jesus. This is what the inscription that you can't see. I can just see the plaque at the bottom, actually. This is what the inscription in front of that sculpture says. It says, "This Maradona is not the meek and subservient figure portrayed in many Renaissance works, but a determined and intelligent young woman who understands the wonder and the importance of her calling as she dedicates her child to the purpose of her Creator. She is also aware of the suffering that this will entail. The figure of the Madonna is integral with that of the cross, the stark and terrible symbol at the heart of Christianity. which is an inescapable part of her existence. Her expression, however, is more of serenity than anguish. She's looking beyond Calvary to the resurrection, and the way in which she holds the Christ child high suggests the subsequent ascension rather than the immediate prospect of a sacrificial death. When the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, lived among us, died among us, died for us, that's when we see most clearly God's glory. God's glory is seen in his goodness to us, the fullness of his grace and truth, which is seen when we look on his Son. There is a sense, isn't there? There was a sense in which he was the one who would be lifted up, bowed down to and worshipped. But at first it wasn't on a stage or a platform, but on that stark and terrible symbol at the heart of Christianity, the wooden cross. People there would bow down and worship, but not in adoration and wonder, but in mockery and humiliation. But in that moment, we see the glory of God before our very eyes. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And it's the same glory we see in the manger, the eternal Word made flesh, down in our world, in the mess, in the brokenness, to show us a grace that we never deserved. It's that glory that deserves our praise and adoration. And all of this, it takes us back to where we started at the end of the passage. How can people know God, really know him? Well, they can do it by looking to Jesus. He is the one who has come to make God known to us. If there is a chasm between us and God, and from our side it was an impassable chasm, there was no way across it. Well, across that chasm, God has stepped by sending his Son. He hasn't just sent a letter across. He hasn't just sent some words, but he has sent his only Son, who is just like him, across it to us. There is nothing else like it in history. Nowhere else where the Son of God steps into human history in the flesh as a baby to show us God's glory and to make him known to us. Christmas for lots of us, it is, I don't know about you, it is a slightly crazy time, isn't it? Every year, Jen and I say we'll be sorted at least a few weeks earlier than the year before, so we're not running around in the last few days trying to do everything. And every year we're running around in the last few days trying to do everything. There's presents to sort, dinners to arrange, travel plans that seem to continuously change. The last week of work for some, the work that has to happen around Christmas for others, a house to clean, and the list goes on and on and on. But all of that, and I get drawn into it as much as absolutely everybody else, strikes me as a little bit odd if it takes away from, rather than adds to, the wonder of the Son of God coming into this world. The Son of God who, let's be honest, came into a messy, unprepared, cold, dark world for us. It's almost backwards, isn't it, if we make Christmas about all the things that we do, about the magical world or the magical day we create. Christmas is not about kind of creating a space for God to enter into. It's about God sending his Son into that dark, broken world, when there wasn't even space for him in the inn to be born. Jesus came so we could know God, so we could see God's wonderful grace and truth, so we could see his glory. All the other things, the presents, the food, the celebration, they're all about rejoicing over God's gift to us of his Son. Because his Son made God known to us. If your Christmas this year is going to be messy, either because of the complicated relationships that seem to go on in families, or the reality of your house just not looking like all the Christmassy houses you seem to see elsewhere, And in that mess, the brokenness, you can still look on Jesus and know God's grace to you and see his glory. If your Christmas this year is going to be quiet, without all the trappings, without the family around, then you can still look on Jesus, a king who was born without an earthly fanfare that could have been his, in a quiet place to young parents. In a quiet Christmas, you can look on him and know God's grace to you. And if your Christmas is going to be sparkly and busy and fun, then don't forget that Jesus is at its heart. Let me finish with the words from John chapter 1, verse 14 again. And then we'll have a moment of quiet, and then we'll sing and worship our God. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Amen.